Why do people argue about science? And why is that we cannot agree for some things that look kind of obvious for some of us and may not be from others, and for which people really get in bitter arguments. And I have to say that I made my life of studying that. And so the problem with science and science issue and controversial science issues is that they're not just science issues. They're ethical, legal, social, political issues that are very contested in the public sphere. And the problem with controversial scientific topics is that they're controversial because they are complicated, because they have all those dimensions that are going to trigger something that will make us react. This is the type of research I do in my lab, and you should look at it, Science, Media, and the Public. Basically, we try to see what in the policy realm makes people react a certain way, taking into account that media has been changing so much, that science has become more and more complex, that issues such as synthetic biology, stem cell research, even genetic engineering have moral, ethical dimensions that science alone cannot answer. So let's think of biofuels. There was recently, a debate about state funding and so on for the issue of biofuels in Wisconsin, and there was a lot of media coverage about it in Wisconsin and beyond, actually. So what we did, the type of research we did, is like we looked at how Wisconsin residents felt about the issue of biofuel. And what we found out, is like there was not much difference between how Republicans felt about the potential economic benefits of biofuels and Democrats thinking about the potential economic benefits of biofuel. However, if we look more in depth and we paid attention to how much they looked at media coverage of the issue, all right? And now we put Republicans that pay a lot of attention to biofuels, Democrats that pay a lot of attention to biofuel. What did we find? Suddenly, the Democrats saw a lot of economic benefits, and Republicans saw very little economic benefit, which means that actually the same information gets filtered through the political ideology component to actually make sense of an issue. The same information gets filtered through what we call motivated reasoning. We discard information that doesn't comply with what we think, and we amplify the one that corresponds to what we think. So to some extent, in this case, media coverage is just reporting on an issue, but it's amplifying that polarization that we see also in the political realm. Climate change right now in the United States is associated with political ideology. To some extent, if you talk about climate change, people are going to think you're a lefty. Yes, it's true. And that's like actually, like, I see people smiling, maybe not everyone. Again, I'm talking about patterns here, right? It's not at the individual levels, pattern. To some extent, if you remember the inconvenient truth with Al Gore, was the biggest communication mistake that the communication about climate change could have done. You had something that was actually heavily involved in a Democratic presidency that ended up being the spokesperson for climate change. In the American mind, climate change began to be associated with actually a Democratic argument. Once these kind of shortcuts are established in people's mind, you can do whatever you want. It's going to be very hard to redo it, to undo it. So what do? You shift the debate to a common ground. And that's what it's all about in science and politics. What is the common ground? For climate change, you have two ways to go. You could do like Leonardo DiCaprio at the last Oscar in Hollywood that said, climate change is happening, we need to do something about it, which seems very preachy and very obnoxious because after all, it's just his job. Or you could do what Arnold Schwarzenegger did, which is, I don't need to prove to anyone if it happens or not. What I need is a stable energy because that's going to create jobs. This is a common ground that people can discuss and go beyond, to some extent, those polarization and arguments that end up pitting people against each other.
Science seems to me is always evolving and changing, and that's one of the things I think we struggle with as scientists is to communicate that change.
You trying to anticipate as much as possible. What does insurance do? How do they charge us such big policies? Because they anticipate everything. Everything. Obviously, you cannot have the worst case scenarios, anticipated, but you can anticipate some things and try to come up with communication plans for doing it. Again, scientists by themselves in each discipline cannot do that, but my hope is with the science of tomorrow, we take that into account, that this has to be taken into account, anticipate these kind of things in order to be instead of being reactive, to be proactive.
Do you feel in the United States we politicize arguments about science more than in other countries?
So I think it depends of the type of scientific enterprise you're talking about. I mean, for climate change, certainly that's the case. And I would argue that, as I was explaining with the early parts of the debate with Al Gore, this really contributed to have that politicization of science. For other countries, let's talk about the one I've been involved in studying, which is France, Germany, Japan. What did we do? Worked a little bit in India and so on. It's not always politicization, but certainly, a lot of activism that come to play that tends to polarize. We do have new media environment that actually makes it much easier to actually communicate very rapidly about things. So you can actually have people that rally around some language and to some extent what we call the risk communication, amplify some risk or attenuate a risk in a way that wasn't possible before. And it's not always about politics, it's about extreme ideas. The way we think about that is think about public opinion as a normal curve, right? So you have a curve like that. The vast majority of people in the middle are like, well, whatever, we're busy. And then you have here the very extreme person that's pro. And then here you have the very anti, super vocal. Those are the ones you hear in the media everywhere, and those polarize the debate. It's not always about politics.
How has technology influenced the divide between science and politics, and can technology be used to bridge that gap?
And so the technology can, and if we think of technology as far as new media technology, they can amplify risk perception, right? Things can become viral, and the more scary something or the funnier, the more we send it around, right? And so obviously this is the kind of things that can participate in polarizing the debate. In my lab, what we use is intelligent algorithms. So what we do is we teach a machine to think like a human being. Let's say, for example, to see how people talk about GMOs on the internet. And so we teach the machine to actually look at the potential sentiment of different internet posts. And when that machine is trained enough, we can flash that machine and we can do what we do, big data analysis, and then we can see the sentiment of things, right? In the larger scale. Well, to some extent, this is a way to monitor what's happening if people become polarized or not, right? It would be a good way if we could find a way to actually think what people are saying. Not to, by the way, people are entitled to say whatever they want, obviously. But in a way where we can also be participating in a debate in order to make sure it's still rational to some extent and takes into account everybody's point of view.
Thanks so much to Dr. Dominique Broussard.